Hello everyone, this is Wes Terasaki. Today we are looking at the first two chapters of the book of Matthew. Some of this material has been covered in our Advent series, and so we are catching up so that we can track along with the Sunday messages at Lighthouse and finish the entire gospel as scheduled in June. There are many aspects to these first two chapters, but there are some prominent subjects that we might want to discuss in particular. In chapter 1, we find the genealogy of Jesus, followed by a narrative regarding Mary's husband, Joseph. Then chapter 2 describes the story of the Magi that come to visit Jesus, and the later move by Jesus and his parents to Egypt in order to escape Herod. So these topics will be our main discussion today. Let's talk about them in order. First, genealogy. You may recall from our introduction video that the book of Matthew, among all the Gospels, is the most Jewish and is the most emphatic about establishing Jesus as the Messiah and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Here is a slide we saw earlier. Therefore, it makes some sense that Matthew chapter 1 begins with Jesus' genealogy. The first 17 verses of Matthew 1 trace Christ's lineage from Abraham to Joseph, and is one of the two genealogies of Jesus found in the New Testament. The other one is in the Gospel of Luke. As you look at this list, you're likely to see some familiar names: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Boaz, Solomon, and Zerubbabel, all men whose stories are told elsewhere in the Old Testament. And there are many names we don't recognize also. What does this genealogy of Christ tell us? Well, at least these things. Jesus came into human history as a real person. Some of the earliest opponents of Christianity claimed that Jesus was God but not truly human, so he did not actually die on the cross, he only appeared to, and therefore was not resurrected. Matthew emphatically says no. There is no doubt that he was born like any other human being, had parents, and a traceable ancestral line. Jesus began to fulfill the promise God made to Abraham 2,000 years before, that he would make Abraham a great nation and that through him all nations would be blessed. Jesus was a direct descendant of King David, whom God had said would have an everlasting kingdom. Isaiah had said, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever." Jesus ushers in a kingdom of redemption that involves all who would believe in him. It is striking that Christ's genealogy includes 4 women who all have dubious backgrounds. Tamar of Canaan was a daughter-in-law of the patriarch Judah. She became pregnant by posing as a prostitute to Judah and preserved the lineage of Judah despite her questionable actions. One of her sons by this illicit union, Perez, became the ancestor of King David and thereby an ancestor of Christ. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute who helped hide Israelite spies when Joshua's army was about to conquer Jericho. As a result, her life and that of her family were spared. And this is significant because her son Boaz married Ruth, who was also part of the genealogy. Ruth was a Moabite. Moabites were excluded from the temple, but Ruth adopted the God of Israel as her own and had an entire book of the Bible named after her. The ex-wife of Uriah the Hittite, whom we otherwise know as Bathsheba, was ultimately the mother of King Solomon. Scholar Scott McKnight has said that the mention of these women in the genealogy, a very unusual occurrence in ancient genealogies, emphasizes God's gracious acts of redeeming even those deemed unworthy by others. Note that chapter 1 does not end with the completion of the genealogy. There is further information given us regarding Joseph. The New International Version of the Bible gives us an additional subheading: Joseph accepts Jesus as his son. Other versions sometimes call this section the birth of Christ, although a more detailed birth narrative is the one recounted in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew centers not so much on the details of Christ's birth, but on Joseph's reaction to Mary's pregnancy. The emphasis is at the end of chapter 1, and that is Joseph accepts Jesus as his son. This establishes and confirms Christ's physical and legal connection to this ancestry. And it also tells us something about Joseph's character and faith. We see Joseph as a man sensitive to the law, to Mary, and to God. In chapter 2, we see the appearance of the Magi. We previously encountered the Magi in our introductory video. They travel from the east in the belief that they would find the one who has been born King of the Jews. These men are not likely to be kings, but rather sorcerers and astrologers. They are sometimes called wise men. The Old Testament book of Daniel mentions members of the royal court who were called wise men, enchanters, and magicians, centuries before in Persia. Apparently, kings relied on their counsel. In Acts, Philip, Peter, and John encountered Simon the sorcerer. On the island of Cyprus, Paul and his companions on their first missionary journey had a confrontation with Elymas, otherwise called Bar-Jesus, who was a Jewish sorcerer and false prophet. The Magi of Matthew were not Jews, and we probably should not think of them as wise men in the sense of biblical prophets, scribes, or rabbis. Of course, it is God who makes people truly wise, and the Magi do end up making wise, God-directed decisions regarding seeking the true king of the Jews, who was not Herod, and later avoiding the evil king. And here's an important point. They were not guided by stars, but by God. The escape to Egypt by Jesus and his family was necessitated by Herod's determination to eliminate Jesus as a threat to his kingship. Not long after the visit of the Magi, Herod issues an edict that all young males 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem be executed. How horrible is that? The distance from Bethlehem to the border would have been about 75 miles. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus probably made the trip in a matter of days. Remarkably, the reverse trip had taken Moses and the Israelites 40 years. How could they simply grab some belongings and leave at a moment's notice? Well, first of all, they probably didn't own much to begin with. But what they did have was valuable and portable. After all, what had they just been given but expensive frankincense, myrrh, and gold by the Magi? I looked it up. These were valuable items. In all likelihood, God had financed their trip. Egypt was a natural place to which to flee. It was nearby, had a well-ordered Roman province outside of Herod's jurisdiction, and had a population of about 1 million Jews. Herod was ruthless and paranoid. His order to kill the young boys is consistent with all that we know of Herod. He killed all potential rivals, including members of his own family, in order to consolidate his power. He imprisoned Jewish civic leaders with orders that they be executed when he died, so that the people would mourn at the time of his death. It is hard to imagine anyone more cruel. His actions in Bethlehem were ultimately futile. Not only did Jesus escape, but Herod died shortly thereafter, long before Jesus became an adult. Fortunately, his orders to execute the leaders were not carried out. But the death of children in Bethlehem was a tragic occasion. Matthew points out that it symbolically fulfills a prophecy in Jeremiah. In verse 18, Rachel is said to be weeping in Ramah. Ramah was a city that lay just north of Jerusalem on the way to Bethel. It is where Rachel was buried, and it is also likely where the Babylonians had gathered the Israelites on their way to exile. So the sadness of the capture of Israel is symbolically depicted in Jeremiah as Rachel mourning from her grave the loss of her children, who are her descendants. The same grief is now expressed in Bethlehem. One thing that we'll find in the Bible is how persons, places, and things foreshadowed in the Old Testament are re-expressed in the New. St. Augustine said it well. In the Old Testament, the New Testament lies hidden. In the New Testament, the Old Testament stands revealed. There are striking similarities between the family's escape to Egypt and Israel's captivity in Egypt back in the book of Genesis. Both Jesus and Israel are saved from extinction by going to Egypt. God brings both out of Egypt to the promised land. There are times when God calls Israel my son. So when Hosea says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," there is both a past and a present reality being expressed. No wonder that some have looked at Christ as the new Moses and the new Israel. Jesus was the legitimate representative of the nation of Israel. He replicated Israel's national history in his own life. Eventually, Jesus and his family were able to return. Even though Herod had died, his son, Herod Archelaus, was just as ruthless and violent. So to avoid him, his family circumvents Judea and settles in Nazareth. As we close, let's take a moment to talk about Herod. When you hear his name in the New Testament, it can be confusing as to who this man is. He seems to be everywhere, always in authority throughout the Gospels and Acts. Part of the difficulty is that there are at least 6 different Herods mentioned in the Bible. They are a succession of kings, all placed in power by the Romans around the 1st century AD. We have already encountered 2 of them. Herod the Great was the one in power at the time of Jesus' birth. He was not actually Jewish, although he falsely portrayed himself a devout Jew. His father was Idumean, Edomite, and his mother was Nabatean, Arabian. He is the one from whom Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt. When he died in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided among 3 of his sons. Archelaus received half the kingdom and was called an ethnarch. His land included Judea and Samaria. Antipas received a quarter of the kingdom and was called a tetrarch. His land included Galilee. He is the Herod that executed John the Baptist and presided over Christ's trial. Herod Philip presided over a quarter of the kingdom northeast of the Sea of Galilee. We know little else about him. Herod Archelaus was so mean that he was removed ultimately from office by the Romans themselves. When this happened, the Romans replaced him with a Roman governor, or a series of Roman governors, the most famous of which was Pontius Pilate. Then eventually, they were replaced by kings named Herod Agrippa, whom we learn more about later in the book of Acts. So for the purposes of our understanding of the Gospel of Matthew, the important Jewish kings are Herod the Great and his sons Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. As we begin our study of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2 help set the stage by giving us 3 major underlying themes. It would be good for us to keep these in mind. First, Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament scripture. As you may notice, Matthew quotes the Old Testament 5 times in these opening chapters. Second, Matthew tells us right off the bat who Jesus is. He is the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and Emmanuel. Furthermore, he tells us the important locations where Jesus has come from, all of which have messianic significance: Bethlehem, Egypt, and Nazareth. And lastly, Matthew is clear. The legitimate king of the Jews is not named Herod. His name is Jesus.